So I promise not to bend your ears too long before we open this up for conversation, but like I said, I thought maybe a little bit of context about where this film emerged from, not just cinematically and artistically, but politically and historically at this moment in England might be useful.
I don't think your mic is on.
Ah, thank you. Thank God you're here. Okay. So a little bit of context historically, and then a couple of things about the filmmakers, because their involvement in this movie is expected in some ways and unexpected in others. So if I mention the Wolfenden report, does that resonate for people already at all?
Yeah.
No.
So in the 50s, there had been a sort of mounting number of occasions in which distinguished men in public life, homosexuality was illegal in England for men, not for women, had been arraigned and sort of made media circuses out of on exactly these kinds of laws. So some of them were eminent professionally. The actor John Gilles, who I'm sure you know, ran afoul of one of these scandals. And there started to be so many more of them, and they started to make contact with people who the public had some investment in, that there was an increasingly polarized debate between people who felt like this is proof that they really are everywhere, we've got to get them, versus another side that said, this has gone way too far. What the policeman says at the end of the movie about the blackmailer's charter, about how these laws only seem to exist to railroad and humiliate as much as possible these men in public life. So there was quite a dispute, and Parliament commissioned a report headed by a man named Lord Wolfenden to do an investigation about how these laws worked, whether they actually were effective in any way of protecting the public from any particular scourge. It was not really obvious how that report was going to go, but when it was published in 1957, this was drafted by 15 people, 14 of the 15, with one dissenter, said, we think that it's long time past for these laws to be repealed. This was not an absolute breakthrough for what we would consider now progressive thought. The logic of the report was that homosexuality is an incurable disease with fairly few implications for anybody except the person who suffers from it. And so the idea that they used a lot of analogies to disability, said we're basically being incredibly hard on people who have no choice but to be who they are. And all of the myths and rhetoric about public harm are totally overblown. And so 14 of the 15 of us say as soon as possible we should repeal all of these laws. So it kept not happening, it kept not happening. By 1967, the Sexual Offenses Act was passed 10 years later, with some conditional rephrasing of as long as homosexual acts were consensual, they were among people over 21, and they were in private, which had a whole bunch of other asterisks. If there were more than 2 people involved in a given act, that no longer counts as private, for example. But that was passed in 1967 in England and Wales. After 10 years of increasing campaigns and some pretty vigorous attempts from some parliamentarians to get those laws overturned, but it took about 10 years. And when it did happen in 1967, one of the earls in the House of Lords wrote to Dirk Bogarde and said, I didn't even see your movie when it was in theaters, but I've caught it on television, as have a lot of my friends, and I think you deserve a lot of the credit for what we actually were just able to accomplish. And Dirk Bogarde sort of deflected the credit back to him, and they had a mutual admiration society for a while, but it is one of those movies that even though it was not an enormous hit, its profit margin was about £15,000, it did manage to enter the public discourse even for people who hadn't seen it, and did seem to escalate a lot of public sympathy for the cause. So who were the filmmakers? So right as the Wolfenden report came out in 1957, Basil Dearden, who's the director of this movie, and you might have noticed that the movie is billed at the beginning as by Michael Relf and Basil Dearden. That's the producer and the director sharing authorship credit of the movie. That's relatively rare. You might remember things like that with the Merchant Ivory team, for example, but usually the director is the sort of sole signatory of the movie. But they had been working together quite regularly through a pretty distinguished career in the Ealing studio in the UK in the 40s and 50s, were kind of the only famous directors and producers from the Ealing School, which gave you Kind Hearts and Coronets and The Lady Killers and some very famous British comedies. Many of those directors kind of failed once Ealing began to fold to get a foothold in the industry or keep one. These two actually did quite well. And were famous for not only producing more movies, they made about 2 a year, but really liked to vary up the style and the ambition and the orientation of their films. So towards the end of the 50s, they had gotten a little more invested in kind of socially responsive and conscious cinema than they had been before, as was their most regular screenwriter, a woman named Jane Green. She's credited here with her husband, but according to both of them, they were really good fellow brainstormers, but once they had their idea and their characters and their plot worked out, Jane was unmistakably the author of the scripts. So Jane, like a good screenwriter, her diary still exists in the British Library and kept a sort of running list of movies that she thought she wanted to write. And by 1959, when she had just had a big hit with the same director and producer with a film called Sapphire, that you can also see in the same Criterion box set that has Victim, which was a story about a murdered woman whom the police are investigating. How does her body wind up in Hampstead Heath, and discover about a third of the way into that investigation that she was a black woman passing as white in England. And so their investigations are taking them to a whole range of white, black, and mixed enclaves around London, and figuring out that this world is much more mixed than they had anticipated. That film had done quite well in England and had done even better in the United States. The New York Film Critics voted that the third best movie of the year, behind The Nun Story and Ben-Hur, I think. So they had a lot of choice about what they might want to make. And Janet Green was looking at her list of scripts she was interested in, one of which was going to be a South Seas pirate thriller, and one of which was going to be a blackmail story, because she'd never written one. And then she read about the Wolfenden Report and thought, well, this is a perfect synthesis of kind of topicality, which we've been going for, and a kind of mystery plot that I really like writing. One of the reviews of Victim when it came out said that Janet Green could turn the Noise Reduction Act into a whodunit. She was well known for being quite clever at how to gin up mystery plots out of things that didn't obviously lend themselves to that. So all three were in. Janet Green started writing in March of 1960, produced 5 drafts, ended up in October of 1960. They filmed in the spring, and the film was ready as the only British film invited to the Venice Film Festival in 1961. So it happened pretty quickly. It was not entirely harmonious among the director, producer, and the screenwriter as time went on, in part because she felt like the producer and the director kept wanting to push the propaganda and the topicality, and she really wanted to be what she thought of as much more loyal to the characters and to the world that she was describing, and that the audience was really going to sniff out a lot of blatant messaging, and they really liked that stuff baked into a plot more than they liked being told what to think. There are also some interesting disagreements in the letters exchanged among all of them, which are also still in the British Library, where the producer and the director say, we're on draft 4, and it just feels like too many of the gay characters in this movie are deeply apologetic for who they are, and keep saying nature has played me a bad hand, or I can only help being the way that I am. Since I can't, it's not fair that people pick on me. And they said, well, our guess is that most of the gay people in the world probably don't wish they were like anybody else. They probably are quite happy being exactly who they are, and it's the way society treats them that they view as the problem. And Janet Green writes back and says, I would love if in all the research I did for this script, that's what I was hearing, but almost every gay man I interviewed told me a version, at least here in 1960, of I would change myself if I could, but I can't, and so what's the point of the world treating me the way that it does? So there were all kinds of contestations about how this should go, but by the fall they were pretty much ready to go. They had offered the lead part to Jack Hawkins, who you might know best as one of the top military brass in The Bridge on the River Kwai. He was being offered a part in Lawrence of Arabia, for which he turned this down. James Mason wanted to do it, but for tax reasons could not afford to make one more movie in the same calendar year in the UK, or else I guess he'd owe somebody a pot of money. So he said no, a few other people said no. But then Dirk Bogarde, who spent the entire 50s as the most bankable matinee idol in British cinema, was currently miserable on a set in Mexico where he was playing a gay bandit in a movie called The Singer But Not the Song, which even according to his memoirs was about as low as it got for him professionally, of thinking, how am I in brown face underneath the sun playing, singing these songs. He was supposed to be kind of a troubadour too, as well as a bandit and a villain. And was desperate to establish some artistic cachet. And so the producers on a lark sent it to him. They also realized they really needed, they had a pretty modest expectations of how bankable an actor they were going to get because of the subject matter. But they thought, well, we'll start with Dirk and we'll see moving our way down. the reason they knew they needed an especially bankable star was because since the US cinema still forbade any discussion of homosexuality overtly at all, they knew they could not count on any revenues from the States. So all the money this movie was going to make was going to have to be made in the UK. So they started with Dirk with their fingers crossed and were amazed that he said yes. It's not clear how much the filmmakers knew about Dirk Bogarde's personal life. They sort of pieced it together as time went on during filming and afterward, as he started becoming slightly more forthcoming. And Dirk Bogarde was not somebody who ever kind of uttered a coming out phrase, even in his later memoirs, but did live with the same man for about 25 years near the end of his life. Well, that's actually quite a bit of his life. And was quite aware that taking this part was going to mean confronting some of the same questions and rumors and inquiries into his personal life that the character is facing. But felt both like it was important to tell this story for all the same reasons the filmmakers wanted to make it, and also that if that was the tariff he sort of had to pay to make his way into a kind of filmmaking that was not so popcorn and was not so anodyne, but meant he got to be in movies that really said something, he was willing to take that gamble. And so not only was he in it, but he came in around the 4th of 5 drafts and did some of the writing himself. The scene where he and Laura, the kind of pivotal scene in the movie where he winds up having to tell her everything and screams, "Because I wanted him, because I wanted him." That's a script, that's a scene that was mostly written in his handwriting, in his copy of the script, including those lines, and he insisted that they be repeated. That the character has to scream that more than once because he's never said it, and having let himself say it once, he would absolutely say it a second time and a third time, feeling the release of that. So he became quite a collaborator with this team in terms of how the script took shape. Something else may be interesting for you to know is that even though the topic was not quite as strictly verboten in English cinemas as it was in US cinemas at that moment, it was still quite difficult. This winds up being the first movie in UK history that uses the word homosexual and the word homosexuality. So there was quite a bit of taboo busting happening here. And so the team was really worried they were going to pour all of this work into a film that then they had to butcher once it came to the censor. And so they decided to get the censor involved right away. And so while they were revising the script, they were sending each draft to John Trevelyan, who at that point still was the arbiter of public taste for movies, who would send them notes back and say, "Oh, I think this scene actually would be trouble, maybe diminish this a little bit, if we could have one more." He didn't love that all of the characters who espouse negative feelings about homosexuality had all these other reasons why we also knew we should hate them. You know, the bartender who's completely insincere, the blackmailer, who even when she's expressed some distaste before, we still don't know she's like the supervillain behind this whole thing. And so he thought some people who were slightly more sympathetic should own up to the variety of opinion that existed in Britain at that point. But that meant that by the time they made it to the finished film and had to run it by him, there was only one line of dialogue that he insisted that they cut from the whole thing, which was in the scene where Scott, the brother, has come back with Laura to the house and they have found "Far is queer" on the garage door. And you still have the line where he says, "I have a son at home, and he's about to enter the stage of hero worship and revering his uncle, and I'm not going to have him look up to this man now that I know what I know about him." There was one more line in that original speech that said, "There's such a short window when children are making decisions about the life they're going to have, and I will not allow him to be at risk of making that choice." And the censor got really nervous about choosing, and not for the reason we might want of like discouraging people from thinking of this as the choice, for the opposite reason, that it might actually be a choice, and we don't want to sort of put that idea in people's heads because then they might choose it. But so they took that out, but everything else amazingly was allowed to stand. The publicity for the film was kind of funny to track. It turned out the filmmakers had met several of these cops like Harris in the film, who felt like we could be doing a lot more for these black male victims if they were willing to come forward. We actually have a lot more sympathy than people expect from the police. So at the first few theaters that booked Victim, they staged these "come meet your local constable" events in the lobby after you came out of the theater, until they got wind of the fact that a lot of the patrons who were rushing to see this film were not completely eager to meet their constable, nor to be identified as first weekend audience members for Victim. Even though it stunned everybody, by doing as well as it did at the box office for the first few weeks. It seemed to taper off a little bit after that, and it did still have trouble in the States, where they refused to give it any certification at all. So it went into theaters with, at that point, it was a different system, but the equivalent of putting it into theaters without a rating. Nobody had approved this for circulation. So there were ads, there were newspapers and magazines that wouldn't advertise it. There were radio stations that couldn't announce it. So it did not do much from each other, or that the camera knows things and is circling everybody and is getting closer to them and backing away from them. That's pretty specific choice for this story also, and resonates, I think, with the way the script is written, such that there is a sort of main detective line, but there's also a way in which every character in this movie is generating knowledge about everybody else. It's kind of a detective story in every direction, and so the fact that the camera is so agitated and so curious about everyone sort of reinforces that. Maybe the last thing I'll point out, and then open it up for questions, is some of the stuff about class and money. In the British response to this film, not just criticism, but audiences, people who wrote about it in their diaries, would talk about what a shock it was to hear the range of voices who were all here playing gay men, that it was clearly not one class or not one idiom or not one part of London, but actors, ticket takers, distinguished barristers, guys who work at construction sites, that homosexuality was something that was kind of a cross-class phenomenon, and in fact involved a lot of cross-class contact in a way you don't always see. To me, that also resonates with the fact that I was really struck when I watched this movie again about how much discourse of economics there is. The bartender saying, no, I hate these people. I think they're nature's accidents. I think they're gross, but I can't afford not to sell my beer to them, so of course I'm nice to them. Or the blackmailer who, after Henry dies, is calling the still unseen force of whoever he calls to negotiate these things, and says, well, it looks like we've lost a really good subscriber, which is a bummer. So they all are calculating, there's a whole economy in place of who needs money from whom. So this is not separate from the issues of money and power. Even those that well-to-do trio of the photographer and the lord and the actor, who are saying they'd rather just pay one big pot of money and move on, that they can't afford to lose everything, as they will if there's a legal case. So this was received in lots of ways. Homosexuality was certainly the thing that was the key word of the conversation. The pamphlets advertising the movie and the posters didn't mention it, all said blackmail. But it did provoke quite a bit of discussion about social class also, and feeling like this was part of a movement in British cinema that was being much more attentive to those issues at that time too. So that's just a little bit of potted background, but there must be questions or other things people would like to ask or just say. I will happily
When you think about the character of the blackmailer, do you think the kinds of the leather jacket, the image of the David on the wall of the dark side, and just the way that he's constructed?
Yeah, the David moment is amazing, especially after he's leaving the room, sort of storming out. He punches that bag, which is sort of vibrating for a while, and then we see Michelangelo's David as the only thing on his wall. When we visited Mandrake's photography studio earlier, there's also a kind of neoclassical, kind of beautiful boy who's the door knocker on that door. So you're seeing a lot of admiration of male beauty aestheticized in a lot of places. That guy has so many of the semiotics that existed in movies like The Leather Boys and in work by Stan Rackage and other people around the same time of what looked like a certain kind of motorcycle riding, leather jacket wearing street hustler. So the fact that he's seeming to be the antagonist of the community, but may well also have some role in that community, or may have those desires. It's entirely possible. In a movie about somebody who is both the crusader and the victim of these blackmailers, you could certainly have an antagonist who's also kind of in the life, as it were.
I'm going to ask some ignorant questions. I'm sorry to relate. This was supposed to have taken place in the 60s or 50s, or before that?
Kind of in the present in which it was being filmed. So it was filmed in 1960, came out in 61.
And just as a background context, homosexuality was was de-illegalized in the 70s in England?
Partially in 1967 with a few qualifiers.
Okay, and then entirely after that?
Entirely in around 2000. In England and Wales. The Ireland and Scotland both decriminalized it. They waited until 81 and 82, which was the same year that Margaret Thatcher reintroduced a previously retired Cold War policy of no gay people can work in the government. So steps forward, steps back. Their relaxations had fewer caveats than the version in 67 in England and Wales. By 2000, mostly, it's not like you feel like the pressures ever get relieved totally, but they're in about the same place as we are.
And here it was in what, the 1990s or 2000s?
It really kind of depends, especially because here so much of the legal framework was about anti-sodomy laws, and each state understood what sodomy entailed differently, and whether that was a euphemism for homosexuality or actually included a lot of sexual possibility that could attach to anybody. So it's a complicated story to tell.
That is, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to point out, Illinois was 1964, first state in the United States to decriminalize sexual contact between consenting adults.
Well, there we go.
Yes.
Illinois.
There's a debate about whether it was by accident or not.
Yeah. Isn't there always?
It is the first one.
Yeah.
What are some other movies that I might recognize that Dirk Bogarde made?
So it's very likely the movies that he made before this that had made him the matinee idol of the English film industry were so here today, gone tomorrow, but commercial hits. After this, where he really did win kind of overnight the reputation as a serious actor that he'd hoped to. He was nominated for the British Academy Award and the Best British Actor Derby. 2 years later, he won for Joseph Losey's movie The Servant. 2 years later, he won again for Darling with Julie Christie from 1965 with Lawrence Harvey. And then steadily, whether it's kind of a double helix of there was some sense in which the British commercial industry was not employing him quite as much, but it was also true that Dirk Bogarde had been completely evangelized about how much more interesting it is to act in artistically ambitious films. And so he started working with people like Visconti, so if you've seen The Damned or Death in Venice, you know Dirk Bogarde, or The Night Porter with Charlotte Rampling, up to all kinds of shenanigans. You might know Dirk Bogarde. He was, at one point, I think an agent who wasn't even his agent wrote him and said, "Are you sure you want to be in this movie?" And he had written back that we can't let France, Italy, and Sweden make all the interesting films. So he clearly already had a bee in his bonnet about where good cinema was produced, and it was not, to his mind, Great Britain. Sure. So this hand and then we'll go back.
Well, the man that won World War II for the British, Alan Turing,
Yes.
wrote the Enigma machine.
Mm-hmm.
They chemically castrated him,
Mm-hmm.
forced him. He eventually committed suicide, but it was against, he had probably the most greatest secret in World War II, and they persecuted him unbelievably.
Mm-hmm. And Milos and I were talking about this a bit the other day, how my view, looking at this movie again right now, I think that this movie is so much more, I mean, of course it's true there are ways in which this film is distancing itself even a little bit from the issue of homosexuality, that it's important that the protagonist has these desires but has never acted on them since he got married, that there's all kinds of guilt being expressed. But even compared to something like The Imitation Game that came out a couple years ago, ostensibly about Alan Turing, but really unable to talk much about homosexuality in that film, kind of give him this female quasi-love interest. We meet him in this epilogue where the chemical castration is well underway, but people who talk about Alan Turing at that moment, at the end of his life where he was being subjected to all that, talk about somebody whose body was in obvious rebellion from itself, had become obese, had become really difficult to even identify by gender, had tremors. Benedict Cumberbatch at the end of Imitation Game looks like somebody in a bathrobe who's having a pretty bad day, but the film is a little nervous, I think, to be as confrontational in its moment as this is willing to be in its. So Turing's treatment was so nefarious, especially compared to what he had accomplished, that even though he falls exactly in that timeline of these cases that had propelled so much attention, it wasn't covered in quite the same way as Montague and Gilles, because I think people were ashamed of what was happening. So that the details of that story kind of got meted out a little more slowly over more time, but it's totally dreadful. There's a hand back here.
I was curious if you could maybe contextualize this movie with the only ones I can come to mind in this relative time period would be the Children's Hour
Mhm.
and Rope. Could you like maybe speak on that for a little bit, because I can't think of anything else.
You mean like sort of LGBT representations in the
Yeah.
U.S. cinema? So Rope was 1948, so about 13 years before this, and if it weren't Hitchcock, it's unlikely that people would have, and same with Strangers on a Train and other movies that he made that had some kind of redolent gay signification happening. People kind of saw that this was probably Leopold and Loeb in that movie, but felt like it had, many reviews talk about how cleverly this sordid real-life tale has been repackaged as an interesting debate about ethics, and Jimmy Stewart being so front and centered in that film. The Children's Hour has a much more direct attachment.
Right.
So around the late 50s and early 60s, Hollywood was already realizing toward the end of the classic studio system that they were losing lots of, why in the world are big cities and even middle America going to see Bergman movies and Antonioni movies when they could be seeing our movies, which are just tanking over and over, and realized that they had totally given up the ghost of anything like sexual titillation, which was just not arriving much by design in American film. And that they were already realizing that the last statute that sort of remained from the production code that had been drafted in the early 30s was this quite ambiguous statute about sex perversion, which was interpreted as meaning different things at different times. In the 30s, people used it to talk about how you shouldn't make a movie that features white slavery, for example. You shouldn't make a movie that features a married couple cannot share the same bed. That was all this broad umbrella of sex perversion. By the late 50s, early 60s, it was understood more as a code word for homosexuality, but there was already some talk about that was just going to have to be retired. We can't afford to not allow films on this subject. So you've got William Wyler remaking already his first version of The Children's Hour, which was called These Three in 1936, and was really keen to remake that film in the way it should have been made the first time. And Otto Preminger, who had bought the rights to Advise and Consent, the novel, when it came out in the 50s, who had been, begging to make it. One could even say threatening to make it. The studios really didn't want him to, which features a plot line where a senator is being blackmailed because of "we know what you did in Hawaii," and has to go to the first gay bar ever seen in an American movie to find the guy he did something with in Hawaii and try to put that to rest, winds up committing suicide, really similar plot line. So the production, the production code office had been having some internal conversations about how we're going to, I even wrote the phrase down, we're going to have to allow treatments of this subject as long as we use care, discretion, and restraint. And somebody leaked that at some party to Otto Preminger, who the next day, having overheard this might happen, this might be coming down the pike, gave a press conference and said, "I'm so pleased I will be able to give the world advise and consent, because the new line from the production code is that we may use care, restraint, and discretion." And the production code said, "We haven't said that, nobody said that, what are you talking about? Who leaked that?" Wait, not leaked, because we didn't even talk about it. But within 10 days, they had to commit to it. So he kind of called them on the carpet to make it happen right then. So the Children's Hour comes out after this came out in the UK, but a couple months before this came out in the early winter in the US. And Advise and Consent was later that same year. Reflections in a Golden Eye was coming down the pike, a few others in the 60s that, and then you end the decade with Killing of Sister George and The Boys in the Band, and the cat is kind of fully out of the bag by then.